This is Sustainable Voices, where ideas for a better future speak loud.
A podcast from Aalen University where students interview experts from science and practice to critically discuss sustainability topics and explore research-based solutions.
We are Ruth and Caro hosting today's session, and we are both studying business psychology and sustainability.
Welcome! In this episode, we're talking about climate change anxiety. First, we'll explain what it is, and then we want to discuss how we can panic sustainably. Greta Thunberg famously said, "I want you to panic like your house is on fire," referring to the urgency of the climate crisis and the need for society to act instead of staying passive. But should we really panic, and is there a way to channel climate change anxiety so that it motivates us to take meaningful action while still remaining mentally resilient?
To find answers to those questions and to dive deeper into this topic, we are very happy to welcome our guest today, Dr. Clara Kühner from Leipzig University. She is a postdoctoral researcher in work in organizational psychology with a focus on climate psychology as well as environmental protection in the context of work and mental health.
Hi, thank you.
Hello, Clara. It's great to have you here. As a researcher who regularly deals with the topic of climate change anxiety, what do you think about Greta Thunberg's statement, "I want you to panic like your house is on fire"? Do you want people to panic as well?
I'd say I don't want them to panic because panic sounds like you're not capable of rational action anymore. But I want people to strongly worry about climate change, to really see the danger that is in there and to feel adaptive worry that makes them act. That's what I would want.
Yeah, interesting. I totally agree. Panic is a strong word. But before we jump right into the topic, I'd suggest let's take a step back and clarify first what we actually mean when we talk about climate change anxiety. Climate change isn't just a problem for the future. We are already seeing its effects today. Heat waves, floods, wildfires, droughts, hurricanes. And there are also slower and less visible changes like rising sea levels, shifts in rainfall, or increasing average temperatures that will definitely shape our lives over the coming decades.
And all of this doesn't just affect ecosystems or polar bears, it affects us people too. On the one side, climate change threatens our physical health through heat, diseases, malnutrition, forced migration, or the direct consequences of natural disasters. And on the other hand, and what is often less obvious, is that climate change also affects our mental health.
Research shows that after extreme weather events like storms, floods, or wildfires, the probability for mental illnesses rises, such as anxiety disorder, depression, PTSD, or substance abuse. For example, after the flooding in the Ahrtal in Germany that happened in 2024, 28% of respondents from an affected region showed signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, in short, PTSD. And that's just one example of the direct effects on mental health.
But climate-related mental health effects don't only occur after direct disasters. And this brings us to climate change anxiety, today's topic. It is sometimes also called eco-anxiety, climate distress, or climate worry. It describes the anxiety associated with perceptions about climate change, even among people who have not personally experienced any direct impacts. It's, so to say, a persistent worry about climate change and its effects. And with that, climate change also has an indirect influence on our mental health.
And that's pretty important to understand, that climate change doesn't solely affect the mental health of people who directly suffer from climate change impacts. The potential group of sufferers is even bigger. Anyone who knows about climate change through media coverage like social media and the news could be affected by climate anxiety, regardless of their own personal vulnerability to the direct impacts.
Psychologists describe climate change anxiety as a mix of emotions: worry, fear, helplessness, grief, frustration, guilt, distress. People may feel anxious because the future feels uncertain, or because they grieve the loss of landscapes, species, or places that are meaningful to them. For some others, it is the feeling of guilt and being ashamed. For example, feeling guilty because we humans have harmed beautiful nature.
Interestingly, fear is often seen as something negative or a sign of weakness. But in fact, fear has a crucial evolutionary function. It prepares our body to react to danger, mobilizes resources, and can even make us more effective in responding to challenges. So, in a way, anxiety, also climate anxiety, can be understood as an important signal and a motivator for action. The tricky part is that our threat detection system evolved for acute dangers, not for slow-moving, complex problems like climate change. Unlike an immediate threat, the effects of climate change are often indirect and gradual. For example, ice caps melting far away or extreme weather events in other regions. So our brains don't always register the urgency in the same way. Yet, we can still feel anxiety about it. And that anxiety can potentially drive meaningful action.
So, to sum it up, climate change anxiety is a psychological response to the awareness of climate crisis. It doesn't only arise after direct experiences with climate impacts, but can also occur simply through knowledge, media coverage, or imagining future risks. And it includes a broad range of emotions. Anxiety is often seen as negative, but actually has an important evolutionary function because it prepares us to respond to danger. While our brains are better at detecting immediate threats than slow, we can still feel anxiety about complex problems like climate change, which can drive meaningful action.
And if anxiety can motivate action, the next question is, how can we channel climate anxiety in a way that actually leads to meaningful, sustainable action without overwhelming ourselves? In other words, how can we panic sustainably?
Clara, in 2025, your colleagues and you published a meta-analysis about climate change anxiety. In this, you synthesized 94 studies to examine the factors promoting and reducing climate anxiety, as well as its influences and consequences. Caro and I, of course, read your study, but for our listeners, could you briefly summarize what your key findings were in this meta-analysis?
Yes, sure. So first of all, I would like to stress that we cannot draw any causal conclusions. So that's important to keep in mind. And we found that certain groups of peoples are more likely to experience climate change anxiety. And these were younger individuals, females, also people with a more left-leaning political orientation, those with stronger environmental attitudes and values and nature relatedness, and also those with a stronger future orientation. And finally, it was also more likely among individuals who were already been exposed to climate change consequences. So, for example, they were there when an extreme weather event happened, and also those who were indirectly exposed to climate change, so to climate change information, for example, because they consumed information or media on this topic. So these were the findings on the antecedent side. And then on the conceptual consequences, we found that climate change anxiety was positively related to different forms of pro-environmental behavior. Pro-environmental behavior intentions, but also private pro-environmental behavior. So this is conserving, such as switching off the lights when leaving a room, but also collective climate action. This is something like activism, for example, and also climate policy support. So people who reported higher levels of climate change anxiety were also more likely to accept policies in order to mitigate climate change. And then we also looked at the associations between climate change anxiety and well-being. And we found that it was negatively related to subjective well-being, positively related to psychological strain and generalized anxiety. So you might say there's a double-edged nature of climate change anxiety because on the one hand side, it seems like it's associated with action, but on the other hand, it seems also associated with impaired well-being.
Yeah, interesting that you mentioned this double-edged nature of climate anxiety, because there is a scientific discussion about the adaptiveness of climate anxiety. So, whether it motivates climate action or rather leads to impairments in well being. So, how do you position yourself within this discussion, whether climate change anxiety is adaptive or not?
The question whether it's adaptive or not depends on different factors. Of course, I think it can be adaptive and it can spur action. Basically, that's the sense of all emotions. They tell us that something is wrong and that we need to do something and encourages problem solving thinking. But if it's too much, it could be maladaptive. And as you said, it could be paralyzing. But I think that it can be both. And it depends on the level of anxiety and also how you cope with it, how you deal with it.
Okay, so it can be both, but what exactly makes it different to clinical anxiety disorder then?
I think it's difficult to draw a clear line because it's kind of on a continuum. But I would say that from a strictly clinical point of view, climate change anxiety would become clinically relevant or significant when the criteria for an anxiety disorder are met, including impairments in daily functioning. But that is very, very rare.
So basically, climate anxiety can be both helpful and motivating for climate actions, but also overwhelming and paralyzing. But rather on an adaptive level, meaning that it is not clinical relevant because it's not an irrational fear, rather a normal response to the actual threat of climate crisis. But your studies also suggest a positive relationship between acting pro environmentally and climate anxiety, meaning that people who engage in climate activism experience more anxiety. So, does increasing climate anxiety motivate mainly, or are activists and people who engage in pro environmental activities more at risk of mental health issues?
Yeah, it's a bit twisted. I think the question, does climate change anxiety motivate action or does it impair well-being? It's not the right question to ask because obviously it might do both. And it's all about how do you cope with this anxiety. And it's definitely not a solution to try to just push away this anxiety and ignore the problem because that won't work in the long run. So I think it's more about how to productively cope with it without denying climate change or minimizing the effects of climate change.
Okay, so we shouldn't suppress emotions, and you said we should productively cope with climate anxiety. But what are psychological sustainable strategies that help people deal with climate anxiety from your perspective?
So there's a nice framework published in the American Psychologist suggesting different ways to deal with climate change anxiety. And they suggest a mix of mainly three strategies. So the first is problem-focused action. So getting active, activism, volunteering in some way, but also private pro-environmental behavior. So these are coping mechanisms that really focus on the problem, which is climate change. Then emotion management techniques, so not suppressing feelings of climate change anxiety, but expressing them, talking about them to others, to peers maybe. Also emotion management techniques, like what do I do when I really feel hopeless and depressed? What can I do to get out of this negative spiral? And the third are social connections. So join movements, talk to others about it, get into communities. So to be not isolated on this topic. So that's what they suggest. Do something about the problem, learn how to manage your emotions, and get in touch with others.
Is it that these coping strategies work well for everyone, or should vulnerable groups somehow be treated differently?
I think we have to be very attentive to specific groups. So, for example, we find that young people worry a lot about climate change. So, that would be a signal for us to be alert in schools, for example, or any other context where young people come together to give room to discuss this topic and train emotion management strategies, to give opportunities to act. And also, we found that people who were exposed to climate change, both directly or indirectly, reported higher levels of climate change anxiety. place, or here also we could do something preventive, for example, for people who experience extreme weather events, to offer programs on how to deal with worry about climate change, and also on groups that we know deal with this topic on a regular basis. Climate journalists, scientists, politicians. I think we need more support programs for these specific groups so that we can offer them when some people from this group need help.
Yeah, interesting. I actually never thought of the people who deal with climate crisis on a daily basis, like scientists or journalists, but makes totally sense that they in particular need support opportunities on how to deal with their negative emotions and the constant exposure to bad news. You have already mentioned that schools could support young people. What else can institutions, universities, or workplaces do to support people who struggle with climate related distress?
Yeah, I'd say they can do three things. So first, give room for the topic, give room to talk about it, offer opportunities to talk about these negative emotions, exchange ideas on how to cope with it. So just open the space for discussions on the topic. Then, even more important, give opportunities to act. So workplaces, universities, they can offer initiatives, projects where people can participate, because sometimes it's difficult to start. People don't know, okay, I want to do something, but I don't know what and what has an impact. And if they then have opportunities or offers that they just have to join, and it makes it much easier. So that would be a suggestion, just to offer opportunities to engage in the topic. And the most important thing, especially for workplaces, which are organizations, do something about climate change. So that ultimately is the best way to reduce feelings of climate change anxiety, to do something about climate change on a large scale. So that's what politicians have to do, but also, of course, economic leaders, especially of large corporations, because we know that economic activities are one of the major contributors to climate change. And the best thing these corporations can do to change their business models and their business processes so that they don't have this negative environmental impact anymore. So that's, I would say, the most important thing.
I totally agree. It is very important to provide a safe space and opportunities to talk about the topic. And also, it's fundamental that organizations start to make a difference. So, if you could change one thing in the way society deals with climate change anxiety, what would it be?
Sometimes the topic is framed in the media as a clinical problem of hysteric young people, but it's not. It's an adaptive reaction to an actual threat. And I would appreciate it if the media would present it as such. Not all the media are having this kind of populistic view on climate change anxiety, but some do. So I would like them to frame it as an adaptive reaction that makes total sense. Actually, we should worry about the people who are not worried about climate change. So I would like the media to place it like that and combine reporting about climate change with actionable recommendations, what people can do, where to find help, and how to engage in climate action.
Yeah, again, totally agree. And interesting that you mentioned that media coverage should make the connection to what people can do by themselves. So I think this summarizes the entire topic pretty well. We should make use of the anxiety in combination with giving people concrete instructions or guidelines for actions. After all we've discussed, is there anything that gives you a sense of hope when you think of climate change?
We sometimes forget that we have a lot of brilliant and also very powerful people who are working on this issue. Politicians, also economic leaders, and also scientists. There are a lot of people who know so much about this, and they're looking for solutions everywhere, and they have found out so much. So we have a lot of information already And from a physical point of view, we can still mitigate climate change. We will have some degree of climate change, of course. Yeah, we already have a certain degree of global warming, but we can still turn it around in the sense that the consequences will not be as negative. So that's good news. It's not all lost. We can still do something and we know what we have to do, which is good. If we were completely clueless, that would be much more worrying. But no, we know what to do. Now the next step would be to implement this knowledge, which seems to be difficult. But also the good news here is that everyone can do something every day immediately. That's also very good. So we have the information, everyone can act every day immediately, and that's what makes me hopeful that we can still mitigate it before it's too late.
What a nice statement to end on. Thank you, Clara, for those hopeful words and also that you took the time for this interview. It was really, really nice and interesting that you shared your insights with us and our listeners. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation, for your interest in our research.
Now, let's take a step back and return to the main question, climate change anxiety. How can we panic sustainably? Ruth, what stuck with you the most?
Actually, there were many things, but what stuck with me the most was that the research clearly shows that climate change anxiety is not necessarily a bad thing. In most cases, it is not a clinically relevant disorder or a sign of individual weakness, but rather a rational and adaptive response to a very real global threat. And what about you?
I totally agree. What stuck with me was her saying we should worry about the people who don't worry. I found that actually really fascinating because it gave me a new perspective. In most cases, people who act or engage environmentally friendly are portrayed as exaggerated or hysteric, but actually, it's more crazy to not care about climate change.
Yes, totally. I also found that Clara summarized the topic very well, and she made a good point that the discussion whether climate anxiety is motivating or impairing is not the main issue here, rather, how we deal with that anxiety. I think one important starting point could be providing support for vulnerable groups. We heard from Clara that especially younger people and journalists or scientists are affected. By the way, would you have thought that scientists and journalists belong to that vulnerable group?
No, this was new to me as well. But I mean that younger people are more likely to worry makes sense because it's their future that is in danger. We also talked about what institutions, schools, or workplaces can do, and I think we can agree that they are in a position to provide knowledge, education, support groups, or climate projects for the people. I believe that the effect of being heard and having a safe place to come to when you suffer from climate anxiety, it really is underestimated. This means taking emotions seriously while also helping people identify meaningful ways to act.
Yeah, and let's not forget what Clara said about precautions. We should take preventive measures for people who are at risk, for example, extreme weather, since this will become more relevant in the next decades.
I couldn't agree more. And media coverage should support this process by framing climate anxiety as a natural and adaptive, not as a hysterical reaction. They should highlight solutions and ways to get involved so people feel informed and empowered, not hopeless.
So, in other words, that we make use of the motivation that comes with climate anxiety. I mean, Clara's research showed that there's a positive relationship between anxiety and pro environmental behavior, and it's up to us to strengthen that positive connection.
So, our key takeaways are we can't and shouldn't aim to eliminate climate change anxiety. Instead, we need to acknowledge it, support one another, and channel it into action, personally, collectively, and politically. That's how we can panic sustainably by turning worry into meaningful action.
And again, a big thank you for Clara that she was part of this episode, and for all our listeners out there. If you ever feel overwhelmed or anxious about climate change, just remember this feeling is totally normal and you shouldn't let that paralyze you. Rather, make use of that anxiety and use it as a signal that you care.
So, yeah, thanks for listening to Sustainable Voices, and let your voice drive change. If you like this podcast, check out the other episodes of Sustainable Voices.